I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'm actually amazed that we filled this room up. You know, I've been in venues where like 3 people were there. So, I want to thank especially my old friend Tim Haggerty, who I just met tonight after 45 years separation. We had a drink. Also, my friends Bobby Barrow and Sue Reuben back there. Where are you? Oh, there you are. And it's good to have friends in the audience and, you know, whatever. This is the book I wrote about Michael Collins and the Revolution, 1916, 1922, when Collins was killed. And it's his version of the story. And I think a lot of you probably saw Liam Neeson's movie about Michael Collins and how it was portrayed and stuff. And it's a fairly honest portrayal of what happened and things. But Collins was, the thing about the Neeson movie is that Neeson was like, I would say 15 years too old to play him, because Collins died when he was 31 years old and things. And there's a movie on next Sunday on Turner Classic Movies at 8 o'clock Sunday night called Shake Hands with the Devil with James Cagney. It's one of his last movies before he retired in 1960. And in that movie, there's a character played by Sir Michael Redgrave, of all people, who's called the General. And it is Michael Collins. And of course, Redgrave was probably 20 years older than Collins when he died, you know, so it's, the way that he's portrayed is very interesting. So I thought I would start at the end of how all this came about and how important Fenian New York was to the Irish Republic, which we have today. And my feeling is, and I wrote this I have a section called Fenian New York in the new book, which we're still working on the title. We don't really know what it's going to be called. It's either going to be called, you know, Real Irish New York or Irish New York, whatever, but we'll figure that out as we go along when I deliver it in the fall. But the thing about Fenian New York is that it goes back a long time, even basically to the 1860s, 1870s, but even goes back further than that. But let me start on what happened, the end game, we should call it. Because as I wrote in the beginning of the section, I don't believe there would be a Republic of Ireland today if it wasn't for Fenian New York. I don't believe it could have been brought about. It would not have had the financial backing and, you know, just keeping old rebels alive and keep them moving in the right direction. A lot of the guys shot in 1916 were New Yorkers. Tom Clarke, you know, he lived here and worked on Long Island and was a real New Yorker. He lived all over the place. Worked in Manhattan. He got married here in New York. John McBride was here also. Patrick Pierce came to beg money. That was a big thing. A lot of them came to New York to beg money and stuff. Pierce for his school, St. Enda's, out in Rat Farm and stuff. And so we have that kind of thing. But I want to start on Sunday, November 21st, 1920. And that was the day that Michael Collins decided to stop playing games with the British. And, you know, you can say he was a terrorist. Well, the British were terrorists also in their way. You know, how many people did they kill in the famine? In 1840, the population of the island was 8 million. By 1850, it was 4 million. The estimate is that 2 million died and 2 million basically went to America and stuff. So Collins, the problem with Fenians is they're always wanting to have a battle with the British Army. And you're not going to beat the British Army, which was the best army in the world at the time. So Collins said, we're not going to have this battle. De Valera wanted to have a big fight with 500 men on a field every 2 weeks. And Collins said, you're crazy, you know. And so what Collins did was De Valera left, and I'll come back to that in a little while. In May 1919, he took off for New York. He was hanging out here too at that point. And he took off for New York for 18 months. And his thing was to come to New York, raise money for the cause, be the PR man for the cause. And he left Collins as Minister for Finance behind. Collins went through a lot of things in his mind and says, here's what we're going to do. We are not going to have battles with the British. We're going to have a guerrilla warfare. We're going to come out of doorways in Dublin and just shoot you. We're going to attack your lorries as they go down the Dardanelles, which was the streets of Dublin, Anger Street, Georgia Street, Camden Street. And, you know, they throw hand grenades, just wipe out a whole car. The British start putting chicken wire over the top of them. A fish hook on the back of a hand grenade solved that problem, so that it stuck. And it was called the Dardanelles, named after the famous battle in 1916 in Turkey and things, which was a total disaster for the British. So Collins is moving in this area, backed by John Devoy in New York. And so what Collins wants to do is that he knows he has to eliminate the British Secret Service in Dublin. So he goes about that. He collects names. His intelligence office at 3 Crow Street, which is stuck right between Dublin Castle and Trinity College. The buildings are still there. It's a little alley basically running off Dame Street. In this office, he collected information about anyone. If you were a British Army officer or an intelligence officer or somebody from London coming in on a business trip, you would be tagged from the minute you hit Dublin City. Taxi drivers would check in with you. Guys in hotels, hotel clerks, they would know where you were and you were reported to Crow Street. To go with Crow Street, his intelligence bureau, he had an active service unit, which was known as the 12 Apostles, they worked for Collins, which I guess would make Collins Jesus Christ. And with Collins' ego, I would not be surprised with that at all and stuff. So what he had 12 shooters, basically. In the beginning, they warned all the people, saying, here's what we're going to do. We know you're in British intelligence, or you're in the G Division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, the political division. Get out now. You've been warned, get out. If you didn't get out, they would come and beat you up. They'd tie you to a fence and beat the crap out of you. And if you didn't get out then, they would shoot you. And so the first guy to get shot was a guy named Patrick Smith, S-Y-M-T-H, in September 1919. And Smith took 3 weeks to die, which infuriated Collins. And he says, hey, what did we do wrong here? And what they did wrong was that they shot him in the back with 38s. He says, well, we're going, no more 38s, we're going to 45s and we're shooting you in the head from that one. And that was it. And also he started using teams. You have teams of, say, 2 guys with 2 guys back up, or 4 guys with 4 guys back up. And so this went on where he comes to, he's eliminating very bad people during this time. There was a bank examiner called Alan Bell in early 1920. Alan Bell came into Dublin. He's been going at the Fenian since the Land League in the 1870s. And he's sent to Dublin to find Collins' money, the national loan, most of which is coming from America. So Alan Bell, he's just living out in Monkstown. He's taking the tram in to work every day. Comes one morning, the squad goes out, stop the tram, you unhook the tram from the wire. They went up, they pulled him out in the street and shot him dead. That sent a message. There was no more bank examiners coming to Dublin to look for the national loan. It was very effective. There was also a guy called Jameson, who, I guess is the British sense of humor. We got a spy in Dublin, we're going to call him Jameson and stuff, So he goes up to Collins and he says, I got guns for you and stuff. And Collins says, okay, we'll talk to this guy. Collins would talk to anyone. The British couldn't find him, but people come into Dublin, journalists from America, they're talking to him within a half hour and stuff. So he says, and this is when Collins has 10,000 pounds on his head. And so this guy Jameson, they find out he's a double dealer and stuff. So they get the guns off him. He does have guns. And then they take him up and they shoot him. And this so upset Winston Churchill that he says, these guys are relentless. They're just shooting all our spies, And so Churchill was so annoyed. He was the Secretary of State for Home Affairs at that point, meaning Ireland was under his portfolio in the British cabinet. where he worked for Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. So at that point, he puts a £5,000 bounty on the head of the man responsible for killing Jameson. And of course, the man responsible was Collins, who was sent out to kill Jameson. So that's how Collins and Churchill began their relationship, which would go into the treaty. And they actually got along very well, because Churchill admired Collins's courage and different things like that. So what we come down to is that we're having this war in the streets of Dublin, two Secret Service branches going against each other up and down Grafton Street and around Stephen's Green and O'Connell Street. They would just look for each other and shoot them dead. And so what it comes down to is they're closing in on Collins at this point. And there was a documentary made a couple of years ago for RTE television in Ireland called Get Collins. And what happened was Collins got a list, had his intelligence bureau over on Crow Street, got a great list of who are these people. And he put it down to 14 guys. And on the morning of November 21st, 1920, which was a Sunday morning and became known as Bloody Sunday, he sent his men out at 9 a.m. in different groups. The job was so big that it was too big for the 12 apostles, or how many guys were in the group at that point. So they had to bring in guys from the Dublin Brigade. One of them they brought in was Sean Lamass, who went on to be what I consider the greatest Taoiseach, the Prime Minister in the history of Ireland. He did the job at 119 Bagot Street. Guys like Vinnie Byrne went into 38 Upper Mount Street. I've been in the, it's now a law office, but I was in the apartments, the rooms where this happened and stuff. And it's amazing, you can just see taking them out of the front room into the back room, stand up on a bed and shoot them dead in the head. And Vinnie on tape said, I said, may the Lord have mercy on your soul, and they shot him dead. Now what did this all prove? 1 year and 16 days later, it was all over. There was a treaty. And what happened was the British were in such a state, they were stuck in a quagmire in Dublin and Ireland in general. And this is when they had to get out. And this is how the modern, what became the Free State on December 6, 1921, and now is the Republic of Ireland came about. So that is how, this is the end game. This is the important stuff that was helped by the people in America. And we'll go from there going back. After the rising of 1798, a lot of the men of that rising were either killed, went to France. France was a great haven for them. Some came here. Robert Emmet's brother, Thomas, came here. And as Emmet, was killed, the 1803 rebellion was a failed rebellion. It never kind of happened. And of course, Robert Emmet was taken out. He gave his famous speech from the dock and went from there. And his brother was in Paris, conspiring with Napoleon to see if he could help the Irish, which, don't depend on the French to ever show up if you need something, So Thomas came to America. He came to New York. And he was a pretty successful guy. He was, for a short period, he was the Attorney General of the state of New York. And he is buried close by here. He's buried in the churchyard over at St. Mark's and stuff. And it's amazing, when you think about these men, they're in this neighborhood kind of thing. Wolfe Tone's son came here. Wolfe Tone was the leader of the 1798 rebellion. And he committed suicide when he was captured by the British. But his son went to fight for the French against the British and eventually showed up in New York. And he is buried in Greenhaven Cemetery over in Brooklyn. So there's always a feeling, even early in the 19th century, that the Irish are coming. There was always Irish here and stuff. And then it only increased. And one of the reasons it increased was the new Archbishop of New York. Hang on a second. This is his picture and stuff. He was quite a character. Archbishop John Hughes. He was known as Dagger John because he had a crucifix, a stiletto-type crucifix, and he went around and people were terrified of Dagger John. He didn't take crap from anyone. And he was an amazing guy because he was also very vain. He wore a toupee, believe it or not. And Dagger John was very tough. He dealt with the know-nothings. And the know-nothings were basically the Trumpsters of the 1840s. They hated Catholics, and for fun, they used to burn Catholic churches down. They just burned almost every Catholic church down in Philadelphia. And then they said, we're coming to New York to do the same thing. It's going to be great sport. So the mayor of New York goes to Dagger John, and he says, well, you know, I feel really bad for you and your people. And Dagger John says, I feel bad for you. And the mayor says, what are you talking about? He says, if they touch one Catholic church, we will turn New York City into another Moscow. And what he meant was what the Moscow people did when Napoleon was approaching. They burned the city to the ground. Guess what? Nothing ever happened with the know-nothings in New York. And that was because of Dagger John. But his reputation really takes off from there, where as the famine hit, all these Irish Catholics coming in from Ireland, and God knows how many of them were. They were hitting Boston, New York, Philadelphia especially, some to Canada. And the thing was, Dagger John took care of his own people. And these were tough people, believe me, uneducated, didn't speak English. They spoke Irish or Gaelic, whatever. And what John did was that he didn't like the Protestant infrastructure. So he says, we're not going to deal with their infrastructure. We're going to have our own infrastructure. So he started hospitals. He started his own school systems. He started orphanages. Fordham University was started by Archbishop Hughes. And so as New York became a haven for Irishmen because of Hughes and the infrastructure that was here. Your people were here. They spoke your language if you didn't speak English and stuff. So Dagger John had a great influence on the population as it grew in the 1840s because of the famine. And he was an amazing character. He wasn't perfect by any means. He had a lot of trouble during the Civil War. He actually worked for President Lincoln and things and went as an envoy to the Vatican for the president and things. But, you know, the riots, the Civil War riots of 1863 happened under his watch. He was old and dying at that time. And his response was not great by all means. But he was an amazing character and a colorful character. And, you know, I'm surprised nobody has made a movie about him, really, because he was that good. I can just see him doing his toupee in the morning and stuff and things. Of course, he worked out of Old St. Patrick's, and he is buried with the rest of the cardinals up in St. Patrick's Cathedral. He is the last Archbishop of New York who did not have a red hat. He was not a cardinal. After him, every Archbishop of New York automatically becomes a cardinal and stuff. So, the Civil War comes and goes, and we're dealing now with Irish revolutionaries. Thomas Francis Meagher was sent, he was a leader of the Young Ireland movement in the 1840s. And this was guys like him, William O'Brien, and Oscar Wilde's mother, Lady Jane Wilde, was involved in this. It's amazing how she did not go to jail. And she may have been Thomas Meagher's lover and things. And he was deported to Australia. You know, you've heard of Australia in the news the last couple of days. You know, they get all uppity about immigrants. You know, half the country was, you know, populated by Fenian felons that no one else wanted and stuff, you know. So, you know, here we go. We have Meagher's down there, and he gets away. He manages to escape to America. And where does he go, of course? He comes to New York, where Dagger John is the Archbishop, and there's other Irishmen around. And during the Civil War, he was Lincoln's favorite Irishman, apparently. And There's a book by a friend of mine, Neil O'Dowd, Lincoln and the Irish, and deals with the Civil War and what went on there. And Meir became the organizer of the Fighting 69th and was appointed the general in the Union Army by Lincoln and things. So, you know, we have the great problem of the Civil War. The Irish didn't particularly like the Republican Party because the Republican Party didn't like the Irish. And, you know, you're dealing with different factions. And of course, there's the draft, which goes into effect, which if you were rich, some things never changed, you could buy yourself out of the army and stuff. And who went in? Paddy, who didn't even speak English yet. He went into the army and went to all these places like Antietam and Gettysburg and things. So it was great, you know, antipathy from the Irish to the rest of New Yorkers, so many who were black and things like that. So, you know, you're dealing with this. Dagger John is dying. I think he died in 1864. And so the Civil War is finally over, but the Civil War is an important point in Irish liberation theology, basically. What they're saying is, we went into the Union Army to learn how to fight the British as an army, and we're going back to Ireland to fight the British. Now, this sounds great, but, you know, you're not going to fight the British Army. And the amazing thing was these guys got off the boat in the west of Ireland in 1866, 1867. And what did the British do? They had their spies there already. They knew they were coming. And a lot of them were just arrested because they were wearing Union Army issued boots. So, you know, the revolution was basically over before it started. It was the typical informers, people who were paid off, Secret Service, British Secret Service. The Irish didn't have a chance against these people, which Collins would realize 50 years from now. So you kind of have different ways to do this kind of thing. So a lot of these guys weren't even in the uprising of 1867. Now this is a picture. It's a book called Irish Rebel by my friend Terry Galway, and it's a biography of John Devoy. And this is his mugshot from Mountjoy Jail in Dublin. And it's an amazing thing because Devoy was apprehended before the little skirmish began. It wasn't much of an uprising. It was really small potatoes and stuff, to, you know, whatever. But the amazing thing I know is about this picture. There's several of them, and I've noticed that they've only been taken in Mountjoy Jail, not in Kilmainham. Now, if you ever go to Dublin, if there's one place you want to see, it's Kilmainham Jail, built in the late 1700s, and is where all 14 of the patriots in 1916 were shot. So go there. It is worth the price of admission, and it's one of the greatest tours ever. And you wonder how these people survived. It's still raw and rotten to this day in the place. And it's terrifying, basically, as you walk down those narrow little lanes and things, where a lot of the 1916 men were imprisoned and some of them were shot there and stuff. So Devoy, oh, I want to mention this. I'm in a liquor store last year, and I see these kind of pictures, these mugshots. I said, what the hell is this? It's on a display. And it's from an Australian winery called 19 Crimes Wines. And the cover of their bottles is mugshots of Fenian felons. And I tried to contact them. I wanted to do a story for irishcentral.com, but their PR people are so inept I couldn't contact them. But it was just an amazing look at taking these pictures and stuff, you know? So it's, you know, it's amazing what people will do to market using, you know, Fenians who have been dead for 150 years, you know, God. But here's the story that goes on. Hang on a second. Another guy at this point, and I spent the whole day with Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa today. What a great name. And he was a Fenian also. And he was apprehended in Dublin in 1865. He would I was reading his biography today, and he was an eccentric. I mean, these guys were tough. The difference between John Devoy and Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa is that Devoy was a lifelong Irish bachelor, like myself. O'Donovan Rossa was married 3 times and fathered 18 children. The only 2 things they had in common is they hated the British. And their whole lives were dedicated to getting rid of the British. Now, Devoy was a really good organizer. Not so much with O'Donovan Rossa. And he first got to New York in 1863. He was actually here when the Civil War riots broke out in July of 1863. He did not stay. He went back to Ireland and he got arrested. He was running a newspaper in Dublin. And he got arrested and he was sent to prison in Britain. And they must have had him in 6 or 7 prisons. He was naked half the time. He was incorrigible. He just hated them. He would not listen to them. He would not do anything for them. They used to handcuff him behind his back naked. He'd be on the floor on all fours, and they'd give him something to read, and he had to turn the pages with his tongue. He was brutalized, beaten, starved, almost always on a bread and water diet. He could not look at bread and water the rest of his life. And one of the interesting things I read was that he hated chewing gum. And his daughters in the 1880s and 1890s, when he lived on Staten Island, would be chewing gum and he would forbid it. And what it reminded him of, his whole family was destroyed by the famine. They were fairly well off until the 1840s. And his family was destroyed by the famine. It killed his father. And what he remembered was people eating grass on the side of the road to stay alive. So that was what chewing gum meant to him. He just couldn't take it anymore and things. So, you know, he was here in New York. He's famous for starting a dynamite campaign back in Britain. And one of the guys he gets is a guy called Thomas Clarke, one of the great Fenians of all time. Clarke and Devoy were very close. O'Donovan Rossa didn't play nice a lot. So he was kind of off his own way. He wanted to do things his own way. So his dynamite campaign, which was basically a terrorist campaign, just trying to blow up things in Britain, bridges and things like that, went into effect. It wasn't very effective, of course. And one of the guys he recruited from New York was Tom Clarke. And Tom Clarke went to Britain, got apprehended. I think he was in Liverpool collecting dynamite and stuff like that to bring it to London. And he got apprehended and was sent to British prisons for 15 years. At the end of the 15 years, he comes out and he comes right back to New York, where he gets married. He works for John Devoy at his newspaper, and he's a real New Yorker. He buys a little farm on Long Island, which failed. Tom was not a Long Island guy. He was a city person. He's from, he went. So in 1907, he goes back to Dublin. And Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa is getting very old at this point. He's crotchety, he has a big family, he's living on Staten Island. And, the last few years of his life, he was basically senile and things. So at this point, the 2 guys we're talking about is Devoy here in New York and Tom Clarke in Dublin. So from 1907 through 1916, these are the 2 guys doing the revolution. Very quietly. Clarke back in Dublin, he's getting his team together. He's got Sean McDermott. He's got Patrick Pierce. He's got a young Michael Collins who comes in and says, I'm going to America. And Clarke says to him, don't go, there's something happening soon. So Collins, instead of emigrating to Chicago, where his brother was a policeman, he stays in London waiting for the call back to Dublin, which comes in the summer of 1916. So you're dealing with all these guys and how they're getting the revolution together. You've got James Connolly, who was often in New York, coming in. He lived here for years, organizing labors and stuff. And Connolly is back in Dublin at this point, and he started his Irish Citizen Army. And what Clarke is doing, he has the Irish Volunteers. So you have two armed forces, but they're separate and equal, and they're not communicating. So what goes on is that Clarke says, okay, we got to have a talk with Connolly and things. But I'm jumping ahead of the story. I want to go back a little bit. Come 1915, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa dies. He's like 83 years old. And they planned ahead and said, when he dies, we're sending him back to Dublin to parade his body around, to see what we can get the nationalists going, the Gaelic League, all kinds of people coming out and celebrating this great Fenian. In my opinion, he was pretty much of a failure at what he was as a Fenian. His ideas just did not pan out, and he didn't accomplish anything. But he got young people interested in the cause, which is important. So the legend is, he dies in June 1915, and Devoy cables Clarke in Dublin, says, Devoy dead, what should I do? And Clarke says, dig him up and send him home, which is exactly what they did. So he gets to Dublin, and when you're dealing with this period of time, it's a lot of great theater, because they know there's going to be a rising the following spring. So you have people like Clarke, McDermott, they're all set to go, and this is going to be the launch of the Easter Rising. It's 9 months from now, but this is the launch. So what happens is they bring O'Donovan Rossa back in, and they have masses at the Pro Cathedral. They bring him to the City Hall. You actually can go on YouTube and put in Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa funeral, and you can see the funeral. It's fantastic. The coffin is open. You can actually see the body. He's been dead for a month, but he's there. And I refer to him as the Irish Lazarus, because he did more for Ireland dead than he ever did alive, in my opinion. So you got O'Donovan Rossa, and at this point, Clarke is running things, but the British are looking around, saying, who's doing this? Who's doing that and stuff? And there's McDonough here, there's Daly there and stuff. But Clarke is the guy. But he needs a spokesman. So he gets Patrick Pearse, who's a school teacher, basically. Has an Irish school out in Rathfarnham, which is a good place to visit. It's the same way it was in 1916. It will give you the willies, I tell you. You look around, and the Pearse brothers were a little strange, let me put it that way and stuff. But you go to the place, and you feel the ghost out there. But Pearse was a good orator. He had a cast eye. So, the joke is he's looking at you and one eye's looking at Belfast and stuff, So, you're dealing with these characters. But Pearse was a very good poet. Very odd, very strange guy. I mean, he was terrified of women. And like Tom McDonough, who used to teach at his school, would say, let me have a little joke on Patty. And he'd bring in a woman and say, Patty, would you like to meet so-and-so? And Pearse would run off. He was terrified of women. So, so you're dealing with all these kind of eccentric people, And but Pearse could really give a speech and could really write. And so Clarke says, you are the face of the Irish Volunteers. I'm making the decisions, but you're the face. And he was always the face, always taken out. He was known as the president of the provisional government in 1916. He was taken out and shot the same day as Clarke. His life was an amazing story, and he was one of the oddest ducks I've ever read about and things. So what happens is they're going to have the big thing in Glasnevin. So they take him out of the city hall, they run him through the streets of Dublin, and they take him all the way out to Glasnevin on August 1st, 1916. And Pearse gives an oration at the grave, and I will read from the end of it, which is, now it's done, they have actors who recreate the oration, and they did it in 1916. They probably do it like every August 1st at this point in Glasnevin. O'Donovan Rossa was buried in what is called the appropriately named Republican plot. And it's filled, it really is. They never laugh at that. You always think it's hilarious. Of course it's a Republican plot. They've been plotting for hundreds of years, these guys and stuff, you know. So they get him into, he's buried, and Pierce gives this little speech. I'll just read the last couple of lines to it. The defenders of this realm have worked well in the secret and the open. They think they have pacified Ireland. They think they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think they have foreseen everything, think they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland, unfree, shall never be at peace. And that was the beginning of the Easter Rebellion, although it wouldn't start until late April 1916. So, let me look at my notes here. So at this point, we're dealing with the rebellion. It goes badly. It's over. It starts on a Monday. It's over by Saturday. On the first day, they take out Pierce, who get the speech. They take out Clarke. And I think they took out McDonough also. And they shoot them. And this goes on for 10 days. They eventually shoot 14 guys in Dublin. And they shoot one guy in County Cork who was really not involved tremendously, and they shoot Sir Roger Casement. Now, are any of you familiar with Sir Roger and stuff? Yeah, one of the great characters of all time. And born in Dublin, Protestant, and worked for years in the British consulate area, you know, in Africa. Got knighted because he exposed atrocities in the Belgian Congo against the natives by the Belgian authorities and stuff. And he becomes, late in his life, an Irish nationalist. And it's hard to understand why, because he was not trusted. Tom Clarke in Dublin wanted nothing to do with him. He just thought he was a British spy and stuff. And after spending 15 years in British jails, I don't blame Clarke. I wouldn't have trusted him either. And he was liked by some. Joseph Mary Plunkett was his editor at a newspaper. And he liked him very much. The Plunkett family, who were a very prominent Republican family. Plunkett was shot also the next day, May 4, 1916. And so you're dealing with Casement. And Casement had delusions of grandeur. He thought he was going to, you know, get the Germans over here and things, and he went to Germany and things. But first he goes to New York. He's another part of the Fenian plot. Now, I've read a lot of books by a lot of people, and especially by Geraldine Plunkett, who was Joe Plunkett's sister. And Geraldine Plunkett says, Devoy hated him. And who else? Kathleen Clarke, Tom Clarke's wife, said Devoy hated him. Don't trust him. He's a spy and stuff. So he gets to New York, and guess what? Devoy likes him. And, you know, they get along famously. And Devoy thinks he's eccentric, and he has some weird ideas to do things. Like he's going to Germany in 1914 at the beginning of the World War I. He's going to raise an army of Germans and Irish prisoners of war that were taken prisoner during the war and stuff, and bring them all back to Ireland and do everything. And the amazing thing about Devoy is that he gives him rope. He gives him like $10,000. You know what $10,000 was in 1914? That was a lot of money. And Devoy had the purse strings here in New York and things. So he gives him that. And Sir Roger goes, and Sir Roger wasn't a soldier. He was an idealist and things. And he goes, he's supposed to land some guns on Bannister Strand in County Kerry the weekend before the Rising, and it gets all messed up. He's captured on the beach, taken to London. On August 3, 1916, they hang him, although people like George Bernard Shaw and Conan Doyle try to get him, you know, saved and things, but it didn't work. He was hanged. But it's amazing. Devoy, about that time, received an inheritance of $5,000 from his brother's ranch in New Mexico, and he gave all the money to Casement for his defense. And it's an extraordinary gesture when you think about it, because Devoy had money coming in and out, but he had nothing. He had nothing for himself. He lived very modestly, and around New York, lived in hotels mostly. Lived on Morton Street, I believe, in the Village at one point. But so you have this strange relationship, and of course, at the end of Casement's life, when the British were afraid he might get off, they started circulating his black diaries, which were supposed to be about his homosexual romps on 2 continents and things. And no one knows if they're true or not. A lot of people think they're just a forgery of the British Secret Service. Michael Collins said he knew his writing, and he thinks they were genuine, which is interesting. But Collins shouldn't have said that, in my opinion. So, but Michael saw them, and I think the connection is that Michael Collins was Joe Plunkett's aide-de-camp, and Plunkett was Casement's editor, and I think Collins saw his handwriting from manuscripts he gave to Plunkett. That I did an article about it, and I think that's fairly reasonable assumption, because they never met in real life, Collins and Casement. But Casement was hanged, and another martyr for all Ireland and stuff, and that's how it's coming down. But the one thing I should also add about the funeral procession of O'Donovan Rossa was that the next year, when they shot all the patriots in Dublin, 14, there was no funeral processions. They went up to Arbor Hill, they opened the ditch, threw the bodies in, and threw quicklime over them. They weren't having any more parades of dead Fenians in Dublin while the British were around. So you're dealing with reality here, and the war is about to start. Now, Collins is Minister for Finance at this point. De Valera is in and out of jail. De Valera was always in jail, it seemed, because he was warned, you're going to be picked up, and he would go to jail. He says it shows the people that, I'm a martyr kind of thing, I'm a victim. And Collins says you can't win a war being a victim and things. And in fact, Collins got him out of Lincoln Gaol in England at one point to, to bring him back to Dublin. And the funny thing about it, the British were so embarrassed by him escaping that they just said, oh, leave him be, we're not going to pick him up again. So this is the kind of games they were playing with each other. So the big thing that changed Ireland was the end of World War I on Armistice Day, 1918. Next month, there is an election for Parliament. So the Irish say, we're having our election here, and we're going to stay here in Dublin and form Dáil Éireann. And that's exactly what they do. So De Valera is the Prime Minister. His official title was Premier, in Irish means First Minister. He takes office like in the spring. By May, he's on his way to America. He's leaving. I mean, this is the head of your country. And it's like George Washington in 1776 saying, I'll see you guys in 2 years. So he actually goes to New York to raise money and bring the Irish cause to the American people. So who does he leave back in Dublin? He leaves Collins. And Collins says, now I'm going to have some fun. We got rid of De Valera, and he wants to have fights with the British Army all the time. And Collins starts shooting the Secret Service and things. So De Valera is in New York, and who's problem is he now? He's John Devoy's problem. And when he gets there, he arrives, and he's the Premier, the First Minister of the Dáil. When he arrives at the Waldorf Astoria, which was on the site where the Empire State Building is now, he signs himself in as Eamon de Valera, President of the Irish Republic. He made up his title. It's amazing, So, and I think it got to Collins because De Valera went around the country raising money, and he's staying in places like the Copley Plaza, the Waldorf Astoria. And Collins is, as Minister for Finance, is getting the bills back in Dublin. He says, what the hell is this guy doing over there and stuff? Yeah. So what happens is that Collins raises a national loan. And where's most of the money going to come from? It's going to come from America, of course. Where the national loan was you were given their certificate, which was like a check. You could endorse it over to somebody else if you wanted to, when it became, fulfilled. And, it was probably for $5 or whatever things. So that's what De Valera's job was, to raise money for Collins's national loan. So he's going around America doing this, and Devoy is pocketing the money. So Devoy is getting a little concerned that where's all this money going and coming from and everything else. And he figures that, De Valera is tipping into the till and stuff. So he gets really mad at De Valera. And Terry Galway in his book has a great line. Somebody says, well, what would you have done with De Valera? He says, I would have shot him. And, and this is, at this point, Devoy is blind, he can hardly hear, and he's ready to shoot the president of the Irish Republic because he thinks he's a crook. So at this point, Devoy, he becomes a Collins man, and he made a couple of mistakes. He had, in his newspaper, Collins's picture was not known well, and Collins was a chameleon. He could look, he could smile, he could frown, he could scowl, and he looked like a different person every time, which is the reason he was never caught in Dublin. And also because of the Dublin people who backed him up all the way. No, even the policemen in Dublin knew who he was, but just saluted him as he crossing O'Connell Street. And he was always amused by this kind of thing. But the British Secret Service couldn't find him because he always impeccably dressed, attaché case, looks like a businessman. And he said once, he goes, you can steal anything if you wear a three-piece suit. And he was absolutely right. They're doing it today on Wall Street, as we sit here and stuff, So, at this point, De Valera goes back to Ireland. And there's a lot of problems with this national loan money. And so Collins is all upset about this because he's the Minister for Finance and things. So De Valera gets back and he says, well, we want to have our big battle. Collins thought this was over. The war is basically over. That shooting on Bloody Sunday ended the war. It was going to take the British 8 months to figure out how the hell to get out of this quagmire. And so they're going around, and De Valera's there, and he says, let's burn down the customs house. Because the customs house has all kinds of important papers and stuff. The building is still there in the Liffey, one of the most beautiful buildings in Dublin. And so he says to Collins, I want your squad to do it. And Collins says, you're not using my squad for this. This is insanity and things. So what happens is, this is late May 1921. And so they go in, and some of Collins's guys do participate, and against his better judgment. And so they go in, and they put the building on fire. And it's a disaster. And 100 men are rounded up from the Dublin brigades, including a lot of Collins's guys from the 12 Apostles. Vinnie Byrne escapes with his life, who was one of the most prominent shooters that you could find in the 12 Apostles. Paddy Daly just gets away, one of the leaders of the 12 Apostles. So this is a total fiasco. But the British misread it. They said, these guys are still coming at us. What they didn't realize is they had arrested most of the IRA in Dublin. So the war was over, and Collins is going, how can I keep this going? So what happens is the British, with King George V, say, it's time for a truce. We got to get out of Ireland. We're being killed around the world, burning down villages, sending in the Black and Tans and all this stuff. So they have a truce in July 1921. And at that point, it's down to Collins and De Valera, and what are they going to do? So somebody has to go to London. So De Valera goes to London in the summer, in July 1921. And he goes there, and he doesn't want to negotiate with the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, because you'll have to understand this. David Lloyd George is not the head of state, the king is. But Eamon de Valera of the Republic of Ireland, which doesn't exist yet, is the head of state. So he would not be dealing with a co-equal and stuff. And Lloyd George says, this guy's nuts, So what happens is, De Valera sees the political problems with this. So he goes back to Dublin, and he says to Collins, why don't you go and negotiate with Lloyd George and Winston Churchill? So Collins says, hey, that's not my job, I'm a soldier. You're the politician. And believe me, Collins was an excellent politician. But he didn't want to go, and he says, okay, you're ordering me, I will go. And he had his delegation, but he went separately. He lived separately because he's afraid of spies and other people. And he gets to London, and of course, this is mid-October 1921. For the next 6-7 weeks, they will try and get a treaty which will bring Ireland to be a nation once again. And Collins is the only guy there, and the guy he's dealing with mostly is Winston Churchill, who was, at that point, he was the Secretary of State for War, which would include, since Ireland's still at war with Britain, whatever. And so they get along. And there's a great story in Churchill's memoirs. Late November 1921, they're getting nowhere with this treaty. So Churchill says, well, come on back to my place, we'll have dinner, a couple of drinks, and work into the night. So they go back. And so they don't have dinner, they start drinking, Churchill and Collins. And cognac, Churchill's fine cognac, and Collins had a sweet tooth. And he wanted it spiked with curacao, which is, you know, a sweet little liqueur and stuff. And so they're getting on, and they're getting plowed. And so Collins starts losing his temper, and he says, you son of a bitch, you put a 5,000-pound bounty on my head, sometimes known as 10,000 pounds. He goes, and you know, you don't have the courage to own up. And he was getting hot, he wants to fight, basically. So Churchill gets up and grabs him by the arm and says, come here. And he walks him to the end of the room, and on the wall, there's a wanted poster for Winston Churchill. Wanted in the Boer War. 25 pounds. And he says, well, Michael, at least I put a good number on you. And Collins loved it. And they laughed, and within 2 weeks they had treaty. And after that, Churchill was always behind Collins and the new Irish nation. Churchill was an odd duck in that he believed there should be a united Ireland, but he always wanted to be a Hun. His wife used to warn him, he says, don't act like a Hun towards the Irish. She actually told him that, Clementine Churchill, who's a wonderful woman. And she used to, say, stop this, don't do this, stop it. And it had a big effect on him when Churchill was really mad at something that the IRA did or whatever. So, and that, at this point, we have the treaty, it goes through the Dáil. Collins is now leading the government with Arthur Griffith. De Valera withdraws. Collins is trying to get everyone back together again. Things are not going well. The anti-treaty forces occupy the forecourts in Dublin on the Liffey. And Churchill finally says, look, you're going to blast them out, or the British Army's going to blast them out. So Collins blasts them out and things. And that's June of 1922. And slowly but surely, the Free State is getting control of the country again, the new government things. And Collins goes down to Cork in the end of August 1922 because they have recaptured most of Cork. And he basically wants to talk to the rebels, saying, let's make a deal here. We can do something. And Collins was friends with these people. So he had a great affinity for these people. And that's why he allowed the forecourts to be occupied for 2 months without doing anything, because he wanted to get these guys on his side. And he knew he could. And he was the only one who could, because Collins in Dublin was always the man. If you came in from the countryside, Collins was the man with the money. Collins was the man with the orders. So that's how it worked. So he's trying down to do it, and he's riding around, and he was drinking that day. Let me put it that way. He was with Emmett Dalton, General Emmett Dalton, and they were riding around, and somebody asked Dalton years later, who was one of the founders of Ardmore Studios in County Wicklow and things, and a friend of Sean Lamas and things, although they were on different sides in the Civil War. And somebody said, what were you doing that day? He says, we were being assholes that day. And so what happens is Collins is going back, and this is Collins's country. He was born in West Cork, Clonakilty, that area and stuff. He knows the area, and he's going back roads in a touring car. And he makes the worst decision of his life, where they're fired on by anti-treaty forces. And Dalton says, drive like hell, and Collins says, no, we'll stop and fight. And what happens is he gets hit in the back of the head, and he's killed. And so that is when, this is Ireland. This is the nation we have now. And it's going into a massive civil war. And Brendan Behan, if I can recall it from memory, I didn't write it down or anything, but Brendan Behan's mother, Kathleen Behan, her husband, Brendan's father, was in jail for IRA activity. I think it was something to do with the customs house, the burning of the customs house. And so she often went to Collins for money and things. And she used to go, and she would always call him my laughing boy, because he was always jolly and could make conversation with anyone, no matter what be they, prime ministers or scrub women in Dublin and things. And so the place where Collins died was called Bain-na-Blah, which is, in the Irish, it means the valley or the gap of the flowers, which sounds lovely, but it's a filthy looking place. I've never been there, but I've seen photographs of it. And every August 22nd, the government has a ceremony there for Collins and stuff. But the poem, if I can remember it right, "'Twas on an August morning, all in the dawning hours, I went to take the warming air, all in the mouth of flowers. And there I saw a maiden, and mournful was her cry, oh, what will mend my broken heart? I've lost my laughing boy." So a beautiful little poem by Brendan, actually. And but that is how people felt about him on whatever side of the treaty they were on and things. I've read stuff by Brendan's father. Robert Brennan was like the top PR guy for Sinn Féin during the war. He hated Collins' guts. They just didn't like each other. Collins was a braggart. He pushed people around, impatient with people. But he said he was a brilliant fucking guy. Really. And that's how people felt about him, that he was that good. He died when he was 31 years old. And the amazing thing about Collins is that when he died, you wonder what would have happened in the years ahead. But it might have been just as well he died, because you could end up with this old politician like De Valera just gripping onto office for 50 years, keeping the country in the 19th century. And what you've seen in Ireland in the last 50 years is what happened after De Valera died. And the total liberalization of the country, divorce, getting rid of the church basically, abortion rights. This is a country charging into the 21st century. And I should add something. I met Eamon de Valera once, and it was 2 months before he died. My cousin Jerry Bartley in Dublin. I'm over there. And he says, "You want to go to the John McCormick Society?" I said, "Why the hell would I want to go to the John McCormick Society? I never liked John McCormick, So he says, "Well, President de Valera's got to be there." So I said, "That might be interesting." So I went there, and it was in a room like this. It was in the Gresham Hotel, and I got a seat on the side. And at intermission, it was announced that President de Valera wasn't feeling well, and he would be leaving and stuff. So de Valera gets up, and he's a big, imposing man. Must have been 6'4", 6'5", and he was 92 years old, and still just big, really big, And he comes down the aisle. I've never seen this before in any politician. He put his hands out like this as he's going down the aisle, so people could touch him. He's like the Virgin Mary on top of the globe. He's like this. And so I took his hand and I said, "How are you, Mr. President?" And he didn't say a word. He just nodded his head and kept going and stuff. But he nodded towards me. And 2 months later, he was dead. So it was just an amazing experience watching him. He thought he was, he was so important to the country, and he was to a great extent. He was the only leader they knew for 50 years, either as Taoiseach or president. And he's an amazing character, and you see, even at 92, he's blind. There is such an arrogance there, you know, a narcissism that you must want to touch me and stuff. You know? So anyway, Collins is dead. De Valera goes into the wilderness, and Devoy is still here in New York, you know, trying to figure out what the hell's going on. So after the Civil War is over, Devoy goes back to Dublin, and he's given a hero's welcome, and he's taken around and everything, and 3 years later he dies, and he's buried in the Republican plot, where everyone goes apparently, and he's buried 2 graves, one grave over from where Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa is buried and things. So that's the end of Fenian New York, but there is a little bit more, where come the 60s and the Troubles in the 70s, you know, the IRA was getting their guns from New York because that's where the money always comes from. And I worked for a guy, and so that went through the 90s, the 69s and 90s. And finally, I work for a guy now called Neil O'Dowd, who owns Irish American Magazine and IrishCentral.com, who I write for, and the Irish Voice. And the amazing thing, Neil was the guy who picked Bill Clinton out. He says, this guy can do it. We need somebody who can stop this war in Northern Ireland. He picked Clinton out. And I have a lot of criticisms of Clinton, but he was true to his word to Neil all the time. It was an amazing transformation where there's great prejudice in this country in the State Department. I'm one of the few people who've read Harry Truman's memoirs. And he was talking about when Israel was coming into being in 1948. He said, all these guys in the State Department, they're all bigots, they're all anti-Semitic. And he goes, and this was the same, and finally he overrode them and recognized Israel. And this is the same thing where in 1993, to get the peace movement going in Northern Ireland, Neil said, you gotta get Gerry Adams, who was an IRA guy. He was one of the head IRA guys. He claims he's never been in the IRA, but he was in there, believe me. And he gets Gerry Adams. He says, I gotta get a visa to get him into the country. You ain't getting a ceasefire without Gerry Adams getting in. The State Department says, he's a terrorist. We can't allow him in the country. And so Clinton thinks about it, he says, yeah, we're not allowing him in the country. And that changed the whole thing, where everything changed from that moment on, where Clinton had the courage to get away from these yahoos at the State Department. And, you know, who they really are. If you look at some of them, the present Secretary of State is clueless. I mean, he just had a bunch of religious fanatics in today to talk to them. You know, give me a break here, you know. But anyway, Neil got this going, and it's a really a tribute to Neil and to Clinton and to George Mitchell, Senator George Mitchell, also the Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, and the other Taoiseach, Albert Reynolds, who did tremendous work, and even John Major, who was, you know, the Prime Minister at that point. They did a lot of work, and the Protestant guys also. They always said, this has to end. But Fenian New York is not done yet. Let's see what Brexit does. You know? So we're, you know, there's a lot of comment that Brexit may be the thing that breaks the British back and makes a united Ireland. And Scotland should get on the ball and get rid of them also, you know. So, but that's my tale of Fenian New York. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to